My name is Caroline, and I am 34 years old. The phone rang at exactly 2 in the morning. I was sitting in my corner office in downtown Chicago, overlooking the city lights, with a glass of red wine in my hand. The caller ID showed the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department. When I answered, a stern officer informed me that my parents, Brenda and Thomas, had just filed a formal harassment report against me. They claimed I had illegally shut off the power and water at the Lake Tahoe vacation home they were currently occupying. The officer told me I needed to cooperate and turn the utilities back on immediately because my parents were asserting squatters' rights to the property. I took a slow sip of my wine and looked down at the crisp documents spread across my mahogany desk. Right on top was a federal arrest warrant recently issued by the FBI. I smiled into the phone and kept my voice perfectly calm and polite. "That is fine, officer. Let them sleep peacefully in the cold and dark tonight. Tomorrow morning, federal prison will provide them with free housing and all the utilities they could ever need." Before I tell you exactly how my own parents tried to steal from me and ended up facing federal fraud charges, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who only looked at you and saw a walking ATM. You will definitely want to stick around to hear how this perfectly executed trap snapped shut. To fully understand how my parents ended up freezing in my Lake Tahoe cabin with the FBI closing in, you have to go back exactly 2 months to a lavish countryside estate just outside Chicago. It was the extravagant wedding day of my younger sister Stephanie. At 28, Stephanie was a lifestyle influencer who cared far more about her social media aesthetic than actual reality. She was marrying Donovan, an ambitious African-American man who called himself a tech startup founder, but whose crypto business plans always sounded like elaborate scams to anyone with real financial literacy. As a senior wealth management consultant, I was naturally expected to quietly fund the illusion of their massive success. The reception hall was dripping in imported white roses and towering champagne fountains. I was standing quietly near the ice sculpture when my mother Brenda rushed over looking absolutely frantic. She pulled me into a private hallway and whispered that my father's premium credit card had unexpectedly declined for the final catering bill. The upscale caterers were threatening to pack up the food right before the main dinner service. Without missing a beat, I handed over my own card to cover the $25,000 invoice. I had been quietly bailing my parents out of financial disasters for 6 long years, so writing a massive check to save the family reputation was nothing new to me. I simply returned to my table expecting a quiet thank you later in the evening. But the real shock came when my father stepped up to the microphone for his dinner toast. The champagne tower in the center of the grand ballroom stood 10 tiers high, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. I stood near a massive floral arrangement of imported white orchids, calculating the exact cost of the display in my head. As a wealth management consultant in Chicago, I evaluate investments for a living. Looking around this lavish countryside estate, I saw a spectacularly bad investment masquerading as a fairy tale wedding. My younger sister Stephanie was holding court near the ice sculpture. She wore a custom designer gown that cost more than a luxury car, posing for photos with her bridesmaids while holding her phone at the perfect angle for her social media followers. Her new husband Donovan stood a few feet away laughing loudly with his groomsmen. Donovan was a smooth-talking African-American man who introduced himself to everyone as a tech startup CEO. Whenever anyone asked what his company actually did, he threw around buzzwords like decentralized finance and blockchain disruption. I had run a background check on his supposedly booming enterprise last month. It was an empty shell registered to a virtual mailbox. I checked my watch, wishing I could leave. I had purposely positioned myself near the exits, avoiding the main crowd. But in my family, staying out of the way never meant staying out of the wallet. My mother, Brenda, suddenly materialized beside me. Her face was flushed beneath her heavy makeup, and she was gripping her sequined clutch so tightly her knuckles were white. She grabbed my arm with bruising force and pulled me toward the service corridor behind the main banquet hall. "Caroline, we have a massive emergency," she hissed, her voice tight with panic. I pulled my arm away, smoothing the fabric of my dress. What kind of emergency? Before she could answer, my father, Thomas, appeared from around the corner. He was trailed by a man holding a digital tablet who looked incredibly unamused. This was the head caterer for the estate. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead, giving me his signature look of manufactured distress. Caroline, thank goodness you are here. There has been a ridiculous mix-up with the bank. My credit card was flagged for fraud protection because of all the large transactions today. The bank froze the account, and this gentleman says he needs the final payment right now, or he will not serve the main course. I looked from my father to the caterer. How much is the remaining balance? $25,000 flat. The caterer said, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. Per our contract, the final installment must clear before the plated dinner service begins. If I do not have a working card in the next 5 minutes, my staff will begin breaking down the kitchen. I stared at my parents. You told me the wedding was fully paid off 3 weeks ago. We thought it was. Brenda said, her voice rising an octave. There were some unexpected overages. The floral upgrades, the extra premium bar packages Donovan requested for his extended family. We cannot let them pull the food, Caroline. Donovan has relatives here from Atlanta who flew first class just for this. We will look like absolute peasants if the staff starts packing up the filet mignon. It is just a temporary hold, Thomas added, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. You know how these banks are. Just put it on your card for now. I will wire you the funds on Monday morning as soon as the bank opens. I looked at my father, knowing exactly what a maxed-out credit limit looked like. There was no fraud alert. They had simply run out of money. They had authorized upgrades they could not afford to maintain Stephanie and Donovan's illusion of immense wealth. I am not paying $25,000 for a party, I said, keeping my voice low but firm. You need to figure this out. Tell Stephanie to use the wedding gift money. Brenda gasped, grabbing my wrist again. You cannot do this to your sister. This is her special day. Do you want to ruin her wedding? Do you want to humiliate this family in front of Donovan's parents? They are judging us enough as it is. If the food stops coming, everyone will know we are broke. You are broke, I corrected coldly. I am not. Please, Caroline. Thomas pleaded, leaning in closer. Just do this one thing for us. We have given you so much. We supported you. We are family. If you do not pay this right now, Stephanie will be devastated. You make more than enough at your firm to cover a temporary charge. They had perfected this routine over decades. The manufactured crisis, the appeal to family loyalty, the desperate pleas to save face, and the subtle manipulation. I stood in the narrow service hallway, listening to the muffled sound of the live band playing in the ballroom. I thought about the mortgage payments I had been making on their house for the past 6 years. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had quietly funneled into their accounts to keep them afloat while they showered Stephanie with gifts, and praised Donovan's non-existent business acumen. If I walked away right now, the caterer would pull the food. The wedding would collapse into chaos. Stephanie would throw a tantrum of epic proportions, and my parents would spend the rest of my life blaming me for destroying the family reputation. I did not want the drama. I just wanted the evening to proceed so I could go back to my quiet life in Chicago. I opened my purse and pulled out my heavy black corporate card. I handed it directly to the caterer, bypassing my parents completely. Run it, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. The caterer tapped on his screen, swiped the card, and waited for the glorious beep of approval. He handed the card back with a polite nod. The payment is approved. We will begin the dinner service immediately. He turned and walked back toward the kitchen doors. The moment he was out of sight, Brenda let out a massive sigh of relief and patted her chest. Oh, thank heavens. You are a lifesaver, Caroline. I knew we could count on you. Thomas straightened his tie, his posture immediately shifting from desperate to arrogant. See? Just a minor speed bump. I will get that money back to you next week. Do not even worry about it. I slid the card back into my wallet, knowing full well I would never see a single cent of that $25,000 again. I did not say a word. I just looked at them, acknowledging the transaction for what it truly was, an extortion fee to maintain my peace. "Come on," Brenda said, hooking her arm through my father's. "We need to get back to the head table before the speeches start. Stephanie wants us right next to her when they pour the champagne." They hurried back toward the ballroom, leaving me alone in the dim hallway. I took a deep breath, smoothing my dress one more time. I had paid the ransom. The crisis was averted. I told myself I would sit through the dinner, endure the speeches, and then drive back to my apartment. I expected a quiet evening from there on out. I walked back into the ballroom and took my assigned seat at a table far away from the bridal party. The lights dimmed slightly, and the band played a bright fanfare. I watched my father walk up to the stage and take the microphone from the wedding planner. He tapped the microphone twice, flashing his charismatic smile at the crowd. I picked up my water glass, expecting the usual generic toast about love and family. I had no idea that the real betrayal of the night was about to be broadcast to everyone in the room. The room went entirely silent as my father cleared his throat. He stood under the golden glow of the chandeliers, radiating the fake humility he had perfected over decades. He held his champagne flute high, commanding the attention of the entire banquet hall. "Family is not just a word to Brenda and me," Thomas began, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "It is an action. It is a lifelong commitment. When we look at Stephanie and Donovan today, we see the future. We see two brilliant young people ready to conquer the world." I took a slow sip of my ice water. My heart rate remained steady, but my mind was already categorizing the hypocrisy. "Donovan, my boy," Thomas continued, turning toward the head table, "you are a visionary, a tech CEO who is going to change the landscape of modern finance. We could not be prouder to welcome you into our family." Donovan stood up and placed a hand over his heart, giving a modest bow that looked entirely rehearsed. The crowd murmured in polite adoration. "Starting a new life requires a solid foundation," Thomas said, his tone shifting into something more grandiose. "Brenda and I know how hard it is for young couples today. The housing market is brutal. The economy is unforgiving. We have always believed that a parent's greatest duty is to ensure their children start their journey on solid ground." He paused for dramatic effect. I watched my mother dab the corner of her eye with a silk tissue, perfectly careful not to ruin her expensive makeup. "For the past 30 years, our house in the suburbs has been our sanctuary," Thomas announced, his voice thickening with manufactured emotion. "It is where Stephanie took her first steps. It is where we celebrated holidays, birthdays, and triumphs. But a house is only brick and wood until a family fills it with love. Brenda and I have decided that it is time for a new generation to build their memories within those walls." The ballroom grew incredibly still. People were leaning forward in their velvet chairs, anticipating the grand gesture. Stephanie and Donovan Thomas smiled broadly, projecting his voice to the furthest corners of the room. "As your wedding gift, Brenda and I are transferring the deed of the family home to you, fully paid off, debt-free, an $800,000 estate to start your new life together without a single financial worry in the world." For a split second, the room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Then absolute pandemonium erupted. The crowd exploded into a deafening standing ovation. Guests were cheering, clapping, and whistling. Some of Donovan's relatives from Atlanta were literally jumping up and down, shouting their praises for my parents' unbelievable generosity. On the stage, the performance reached its peak. Stephanie burst into theatrical tears, covering her face with her manicured hands before throwing her arms around our father's neck. Donovan rushed over, grabbing Thomas in a fierce, overly masculine embrace. He then pulled my mother into a hug, burying his face in her shoulder, playing the role of the deeply moved and overwhelmed son-in-law flawlessly. I sat frozen in my chair at table 42. The glass of ice water in my hand was sweating condensation dripping onto my fingertips. My brain, a highly calibrated machine trained to process financial data, suddenly short-circuited. A fully paid-off house, debt-free. The words echoed in my head, bouncing against the walls of my skull like physical blows. My parents were not wealthy. They had not been wealthy for a very long time. 6 years ago, Thomas had made a series of catastrophic investments that completely wiped out their savings. They were 60 days away from bank foreclosure. Brenda had called me sobbing hysterically, threatening to end her life if they lost their status in the neighborhood. They had begged me for a bailout. As a wealth management consultant, I knew it was a terrible financial decision, but they were my parents. I stepped in. For 72 consecutive months, I had been transferring exactly $3,500 from my corporate account directly to their mortgage lender. I paid the property taxes. I paid the emergency maintenance bills when the roof leaked. I had sacrificed my own investment opportunities to ensure they had a roof over their heads. I had personally poured over $250,000 into that property to save it from the auction block. And less than 20 minutes ago, my mother had desperately grabbed my arm in a dim service hallway, sweating with panic because they did not have $25,000 to pay for the very food these cheering guests were about to eat. Yet here they were standing on a stage bathed in warm light, graciously accepting the roaring applause of 300 people for giving away an $800,000 estate. An estate they did not own outright. An estate they were only living in because I was quietly bleeding my own bank accounts dry every 30th of the month to keep the bank away. They were handing my financial sacrifice to an arrogant influencer and a crypto scammer as a wedding present. My breathing grew shallow, but my face betrayed absolutely nothing. I looked around the room, watching the affluent guests wipe away genuine tears of joy at this display of ultimate parental love. Donovan raised his champagne glass to the room, soaking in the adulation. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery without buying a ticket. I slowly set my water glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. The standing ovation finally began to settle as people returned to their seats, chattering excitedly about the historic gift they had just witnessed. I looked directly at the head table. Brenda was smiling radiantly, waving to her friends in the front row. Then her eyes flicked toward the back of the room. She found me sitting alone in the shadows. For a fraction of a second, the triumphant smile dropped from her face. She saw my blank expression. She knew exactly what I was calculating. Brenda quickly looked away, grabbing her champagne flute and turning her back to me to engage Donovan in animated conversation. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously calculated, that it bypassed anger entirely and settled into a state of absolute glacial clarity. They had used me as a silent ATM to fund their survival, only to turn around and use that exact same asset to buy the admiration of a room full of strangers and secure the loyalty of a golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life. I picked up my silk clutch from the table and stood up. The main course was arriving, but I had suddenly lost my appetite entirely. I walked out of the ballroom, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I was not going to scream or throw a tantrum in front of these people. I was going to wait for them in the bridal suite. The bridal suite smelled of expensive hairspray and wilted lilies. I sat in a high-backed velvet chair in the corner of the room waiting. The distant thumping of the bass from the ballroom below vibrated through the floorboards. I crossed my legs and checked my watch. 11:45. The speeches were over. The cake had been cut. The bride and groom would be coming up here to change for their grand exit. I did not have to wait long. The heavy oak doors swung open. Laughter spilled into the quiet room. Stephanie walked in first, holding the train of her massive gown. Donovan followed close behind, holding a bottle of champagne by the neck. My parents brought up the rear. Brenda was fixing her hair, and Thomas was unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket. They were riding the high of their spectacular performance. "Oh, my feet are absolutely destroyed," Stephanie complained, kicking off her designer heels. "But did you hear that crowd? Everyone is going to be talking about this wedding for years. It was the perfect announcement," sweetheart Brenda said, beaming. "Your father delivered it beautifully. You two are set for life." I cleared my throat. The sound was quiet, but it cut through the celebration like a knife. 4 heads snapped in my direction. They had not noticed me sitting in the shadows. The laughter instantly evaporated. The sudden shift in their body language was fascinating to watch. Thomas stiffened. Brenda's fake smile hardened into a tight line. Stephanie rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. Donovan just looked annoyed that his victory lap was interrupted. Caroline Thomas said, his voice dropping its charismatic warmth. "What are you doing in here? You should be down there mingling." I stood up slowly, picking up my clutch. "I am not staying for the exit. I just came up here to clarify a few things about your very generous gift." Brenda stepped forward, placing herself between me and Stephanie. "Do not do this, Caroline. Do not bring your negative energy into your sister's suite. This is her night. Let her be happy." "I am thrilled for her," I said, my tone completely flat. "I am just curious about the logistics. You stood on a stage and told 300 people you were giving away an $800,000 estate completely debt-free. It is called generational wealth." Caroline Donovan chimed in, taking a swig straight from the champagne bottle. "It is about building a foundation. You work in wealth management. You should understand leverage. We are going to use that equity to scale my new Web3 platform. It is a massive power move for the family portfolio." I looked at my brother-in-law. He sounded like a walking podcast of financial buzzwords. He had no idea how the world actually worked. "Generational wealth implies you actually have wealth to pass down," I said. I looked directly at my father. "You do not own that house, Thomas. You have not truly owned it for 6 years." "Keep your voice down," Thomas hissed, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "People will hear you." "Let them hear," I replied, taking a step closer into the light. "I want to make sure Stephanie and Donovan understand exactly what they are inheriting. Because they are not inheriting a paid-off estate. They are inheriting a massive monthly mortgage, a mortgage that I have been paying." Stephanie let out an exaggerated sigh. "Why do you always have to make everything about you? Mom and Dad gave us the house. Why can you not just be happy for us? Why are you always so jealous?" "Jealous." I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Stephanie, I have wired $3,500 to the bank every 30th of the month for 72 months. I pay the property taxes. I paid $10,000 when the HVAC system failed last winter. I paid for the new roof. I saved our parents from foreclosure while they were buying you sports cars and designer handbags. You are standing in a wedding gown that costs more than most people earn in a year, and you have the audacity to call me jealous." Brenda glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You make a fortune at your firm, Caroline. Do not act like you are starving in the streets. You can afford to help your family. That is what families do. They support each other." "You do not want support," I said. "You want a sponsor. You wanted to stand on that stage tonight and play the role of the benevolent wealthy parents while I quietly footed the bill in the background. You even had the nerve to make me pay $25,000 for the catering tonight because you spent all your money keeping up appearances. We will pay you back for the food," Thomas barked, his face turning red. "I told you that. It was a simple cash flow issue." "I am not talking about the food," I said coldly. "I am talking about the house. I am done. I am logging into my banking portal the second I get to my car. I am canceling the auto draft for the mortgage. I am canceling the property tax escrow. I am cutting off the emergency credit cards you have been using. If Donovan is such a visionary tech CEO, he can pay the $3,500 a month. Welcome to homeownership, Stephanie." Stephanie's jaw dropped. She looked at Donovan in panic. Donovan frowned, the champagne bottle lowering from his lips. "Wait a minute. What mortgage?" Thomas said the house was totally paid off. "He said we had $800,000 in free equity. He lied to you," I said. "He lied to everyone." I turned around, fully intending to walk out of that room and never speak to any of them again. I had drawn my boundary. I was reclaiming my financial freedom. But my mother was not finished. Brenda let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It echoed in the suite, bouncing off the mirrored walls. Cancel the payments, Brenda sneered, taking a step toward me. Go ahead, Caroline. Cut us off. We do not care. I stopped with my hand on the brass doorknob. I looked back over my shoulder. You do not care, I asked. The bank will foreclose on that property in 90 days if the payments stop. You will all be out on the street. No, we will not. Brenda smiled, and it was the most sinister expression I had ever seen on her face. It was the look of a predator who had successfully trapped its prey. We do not need your money anymore. You think you are so smart with your corporate job and your spreadsheets, but you do not control us. Thomas crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug. Your mother is right. You can stop paying if you want. It is not our problem anymore. What are you talking about? I demanded. Brenda tilted her head, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. I already went to the county clerk. I completed the deed transfer last week. The paperwork is filed and registered. Stephanie is the sole legal owner of that property now. It is her house. We gave it to her free and clear. My mind raced. This made absolutely no sense. I knew the legal framework of real estate. I knew the laws. You cannot transfer a deed with an active mortgage without triggering the due on sale clause. I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline spiking in my veins. The bank will demand the full balance immediately. Oh, please. Donovan scoffed, rolling his eyes. You are just trying to scare us. My lawyers handle real estate transfers all the time. People quitclaim deeds to their kids every day. The bank does not care as long as someone keeps making the payments. And someone will keep making the payments, Brenda said, staring dead into my eyes. Because if the house goes into foreclosure, it will destroy the credit of whoever is listed on the mortgage loan. I stared at my mother. The sheer magnitude of her audacity hit me like a freight train. She had transferred the ownership of the property to Stephanie, but kept the massive debt exactly where it was. She fully expected me to keep paying the monthly mortgage on a house that now legally belonged to my spoiled sister and her scammer husband, simply because my parents' names were tied to the loan, and they knew I would not want to see them go bankrupt. They had stolen the asset and left me with the liability. They had wrapped it up in a bow and handed it to the golden child while I was supposed to remain the silent beast of burden. Stephanie smirked, adjusting the diamond tiara on her head. Thanks for the house, Caroline. Do not worry, we will invite you over for pool parties this summer. Donovan is going to build an outdoor kitchen. I looked at the four of them. My father, the coward who hid behind his wife. My sister, the entitled brat who took everything without a shred of gratitude. Donovan, the leech who was already planning how to drain the equity. And my mother, the master manipulator who thought she had outsmarted me. I could have screamed. I could have thrown a glass against the wall. I could have launched into a furious tirade about how unfair and illegal this all was. I could have told them I was calling the police. But I did not. I am a wealth management consultant. I deal with hostile takeovers, toxic assets, and corporate warfare every single day. I know that when your enemy makes a catastrophic miscalculation, you do not warn them. You let them proceed. You let them dig their own grave. Brenda thought she was a genius for filing a quitclaim deed, but she did not realize the massive legal trap she had just walked right into. She did not know what I knew about the specific details of that property title. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating. They were waiting for me to break down. They were waiting for me to cry or beg or explode in anger. Instead, I let out a slow, quiet breath. I smoothed my dress. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, stripping every ounce of emotion from my face. I looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a mortician examining a corpse. Enjoy the house, Stephanie, I said. My voice was eerily calm, softer than a whisper, but it carried absolute finality. I turned the brass knob, opened the door, and walked out of the bridal suite. Caroline, wait! Thomas called out, a sudden note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. My total lack of reaction had unsettled him. I did not stop. I did not look back. I walked down the carpeted hallway, descended the grand staircase, and exited through the heavy glass doors of the estate. The crisp night air hit my face, but I felt nothing. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my car in absolute silence. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. I pulled out of the estate, leaving the booming music and the flashing lights behind me. As I drove down the dark highway, heading back to Chicago, I reached for my phone on the passenger seat. I did not call my parents. I did not text my sister. I opened my contacts and blocked their numbers. I blocked Donovan. I blocked every aunt and uncle who had cheered in that ballroom. They wanted to play games with real estate. They wanted to steal assets and commit fraud to fund their delusions of grandeur. They thought they had won. They had no idea I was about to let them legally destroy themselves. 2 months passed in absolute blissful silence. 60 days of not receiving a single frantic text message about an overdrawn bank account. 60 days of not covering a random credit card charge for imported caviar or designer shoes. I had walked out of that bridal suite and severed the financial umbilical cord that had kept my parents afloat for the past 6 years. True to my word, I canceled the auto draft for the mortgage the next morning. I rerouted my property tax escrow back to my personal checking account. I blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and their social media profiles. My life in Chicago returned to its highly optimized baseline. I finalized a massive merger for a client. I enjoyed quiet evenings in my penthouse. I watched my personal wealth grow without the constant drain of my family's manufactured emergencies. But I knew the silence was temporary. Delusion has an expiration date and the bill always comes due. The disruption arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a portfolio when my office phone rang. Very few people had my direct corporate line. I answered it expecting a client. Instead, the frantic, trembling voice of my mother filled the earpiece. "Caroline, please do not hang up. I had to call your office because my calls to your cell phone will not go through. We are in a complete disaster." I leaned back in my leather chair. I did not speak. I simply let her panic fill the dead air. "Are you there?" Brenda sobbed. Her voice lacked the usual theatrical flair she used at country club dinners. This was raw, unfiltered desperation. "Your father and I have nowhere to go. We are sitting in our car in the parking lot of a cheap motel, and our credit cards are declining. You have to help us." I kept my tone perfectly level. "What happened to your $800,000 estate, Brenda? I thought you gave it to the golden couple to build their generational wealth. Surely they have plenty of room for you in that massive house." A bitter sob escaped her throat. "Stephanie and Donovan kicked us out, Caroline. They changed the locks this morning." The sheer predictability of it almost made me laugh. How exactly does one get evicted from the house they just gifted away? Thomas snatched the phone from my mother. His voice was gruff, trying to maintain authority while clearly drowning in panic. "Caroline, this is not a joke. Donovan manipulated your sister. He told Stephanie that our presence in the house was stifling his creative process as a CEO. He claimed he needed the entire first floor to build a server farm for his crypto startup." Stephanie sided with him. She said our outdated furniture was ruining the aesthetic for her sponsored lifestyle videos. They packed our clothes into garbage bags and left them on the porch. So the tech visionary needed a server farm, and the influencer needed a better background for her videos. I spun a silver pen between my fingers, digesting the delicious irony. They took your asset and disposed of the liability. That sounds like a smart business move on Donovan's part. It is exactly what you taught Stephanie to do. "This is your fault," Thomas yelled, his temper flaring. "If you had not stopped paying the mortgage, they would not be so stressed about finances. Donovan said the bank has been sending warning letters. The stress is making him act irrationally." I stopped spinning the pen. "The bank is sending warning letters because the mortgage is in your name, Thomas. Donovan and Stephanie do not care if the house goes into foreclosure because their credit is not tied to the loan. You handed them the deed but kept the debt. You built your own trap and locked yourselves inside." "We made a mistake," Brenda cried, snatching the phone back. "We admit it, Caroline, we were foolish. We thought we were securing Stephanie's future, but they treated us like unwanted tenants." They threw us away like garbage. We have zero savings left. The joint accounts are empty because we paid for that wedding. You paid for the wedding, I corrected coldly. I paid for the house. And you gave my investment to a scam artist. We need a place to stay, Thomas interrupted, cutting through his wife's tears with his usual entitlement. We cannot live in a motel, Caroline. We are respected members of the community. We need the keys to your Lake Tahoe house. I paused, ensuring I heard him correctly. You want to move into my vacation home. It is empty right now, Thomas insisted. We know you only use it a few weeks a year. It is a massive property. We will just stay there until we can figure out a legal way to get our primary house back from Donovan. You owe us this much, Caroline. We are your parents. You cannot leave us on the street. I looked at the framed photograph of the Lake Tahoe property sitting on my desk. It was a gorgeous multi-million-dollar cabin surrounded by pine trees with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water. It was my sanctuary. A place I bought with my own hard-earned money. The thought of their toxic presence polluting that space was entirely unacceptable. Let me be extremely clear, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. You do not get to treat me like a disposable income source for 6 years, humiliate me at a wedding, hand my financial sacrifice over to your favorite child, and then demand the keys to my luxury vacation home when your golden child throws you out. Caroline. Please, Brenda begged. We are family. Family is an action, Brenda. You said that on the stage at the wedding, and your actions showed me exactly where I stand. I am not your safety net anymore. I am not your backup plan. If you do not give us the access code to that Lake Tahoe house, I will ruin you. Thomas threatened, his desperation turning malicious. I will call your firm. I will tell everyone how you abuse your elderly parents. I will make a public scene. I smiled, knowing the recording system on my corporate line was capturing every single word. You are welcome to try, Thomas, but let me save you the trouble. The answer is no. You will not step foot on my property. You will not get a single dime from my accounts. You made your bed with Donovan and Stephanie. Now you get to sleep in the motel parking lot. I did not wait for his response. I pressed the end call button, terminating the connection. The silence in my office returned sharp and satisfying. They were homeless, broke, and betrayed by the very people they had bankrupted themselves to impress. It was the exact definition of karma. But as I looked out at the Chicago skyline, I knew my father's pride would not allow him to accept defeat. A man like Thomas did not take no for an answer, especially when he felt entitled to everything I owned. My refusal would not stop them. It would only make them desperate. I knew they would try to force their way into the Lake Tahoe house anyway, and I was already planning exactly how to handle it when they did. The ping on my phone came exactly 3 days after I hung up on them. It was a Friday night. I was sitting on my velvet sofa in Chicago reviewing a quarterly earnings report for a corporate client. The notification on my screen was simple and glaringly bright. Motion detected at Lake Tahoe front entry. My pulse did not elevate. I simply set my tablet down, picked up my phone, and opened the smart home security application. The high-definition camera feed loaded instantly. I watched the screen as a battered rental sedan pulled into the sweeping driveway of my vacation home. The property sits on a pristine acreage overlooking the crystal blue water framed by towering pine trees. It is a fortress of glass and timber that I paid for with my own bonuses. The car doors opened. Thomas and Brenda stepped out into the crisp mountain air. They were dragging black plastic garbage bags stuffed with whatever belongings Donovan had tossed onto their porch. Thomas walked up the stone steps to the heavy oak front door. I watched through the doorbell camera as he pulled a physical brass key from his coat pocket. A bitter wave of realization washed over me. 4 years ago, when I first closed on the property, I had handed them a spare key. It was a foolish gesture born from a lingering sense of daughterly obligation long before I realized they viewed my assets as their personal piggy bank. I had updated the electronic keypad since then, but I had never changed the physical deadbolt. Thomas slid the key into the lock and turned it. The heavy door swung open. Instantly, my phone buzzed again with a secondary alert. The interior security panel had started its 30-second countdown warning. If a valid passcode was not entered, the siren would trigger and the local sheriff would be dispatched. I watched through the hallway camera, waiting to see what his plan was. Thomas did not try to guess the code. He pulled a heavy metal wrench from his jacket. With a brutal swing, he smashed the digital security panel right off the wall. Plastic shattered across the hardwood floor. He ripped the internal wiring out with his bare hands, killing the siren before it could even begin to wail. He had bypassed the dispatch trigger entirely. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated and violent break-in. Brenda followed him inside, dragging her trash bags across my custom-imported rugs. She looked around the expansive living room with its vaulted ceilings and the massive stone fireplace. There was no shame on her face. There was only greedy, entitled satisfaction. She dropped her bags on my white leather sectional and walked straight toward the kitchen. I switched the live feed to camera 3, which covered the dining area and the custom climate-controlled wine refrigerator. I sat in my Chicago penthouse 3,000 miles away and watched my mother browse my private collection. She bypassed the standard bottles and reached for a vintage Cabernet Sauvignon that I had bought to celebrate a major promotion. It was a bottle that cost more than their entire week at the cheap motel. Brenda found a corkscrew in my drawer. She opened the bottle, poured 2 massive glasses, and walked back into the living room. She handed one to Thomas. My parents stood in the center of my multi-million-dollar sanctuary, clinking their glasses together in a celebratory toast. They were toasting to their own audacity. They were toasting because they thought they had won. They knew exactly how the laws worked in this country. They knew that if they managed to gain entry and establish physical presence inside a residential property, the legal dynamics shifted immediately. They were banking on the nightmare of squatters' rights. In their minds, I was just their daughter. If I called the local police, they would simply claim they had my permission to be there. They would say it was a family dispute. Law enforcement officers detest dealing with domestic property disputes. The police would tell me it was a civil matter and refuse to physically remove them without a formal court-ordered eviction. An eviction process could take months. During those months, they would live in absolute luxury, drinking my wine, sleeping in my beds, and trashing my sanctuary, while I was forced by law to pay the utility bills to keep them comfortable. They thought I would be paralyzed by the familial bond. They thought I would be too embarrassed to drag my own parents through a public legal battle. They assumed I would eventually cave in and let them stay just to avoid the headache. They were relying on the old Caroline, the one who silently paid their mortgage, to keep the peace. They had no idea that woman no longer existed. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone against the wall. I simply pressed the record button on the security application, capturing every second of their illegal entry, the destruction of my alarm panel, and their celebratory wine toast. I saved the high-definition video files directly to a secure cloud server. I documented the exact timestamps and downloaded the logs showing the forced destruction of the security hardware. I watched Brenda kick off her wet shoes and stretch out on my expensive sofa, treating my hard-earned property like a prize she had rightfully won. The sheer arrogance of it solidified my resolve. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of real estate theft. They wanted to exploit the loopholes of property law to force me into submission. I closed the security application and opened my contacts. It was late, but I knew my lawyer was still awake. I dialed Mitchell's private number. The line rang twice before he answered. I took a slow sip of my wine, mirroring the exact motion my mother was making on the cameras 3,000 miles away. The difference was that her glass was filled with stolen victory, while mine was filled with absolute ruinous strategy. They were about to learn that breaking into the house was the easy part. Surviving the legal trap I had already prepared for that exact property was going to be their ultimate downfall. I dialed the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department dispatch line. I kept my voice clinical and precise, reporting a forced entry and destruction of security hardware at my vacation property. I provided the address and requested officers to investigate a potential burglary in progress. I did not mention that the intruders were my parents. In the eyes of the law right now, They were simply unauthorized individuals who had smashed my alarm panel. I kept the camera feed live on my tablet waiting. 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of two patrol cruisers reflected off the massive glass windows of the cabin. Two deputies stepped out of their vehicles, shining their heavy flashlights through the falling snow toward the front porch. Through the interior cameras, I watched my parents' reaction. Brenda stiffened, setting her wineglass down on the marble kitchen island. She looked terrified, but Thomas simply adjusted his collar. He did not look like a man caught committing a felony. He looked entirely prepared. He patted Brenda's shoulder and walked to the front door, opening it before the deputies could even knock. "Good evening, officers," Thomas said, his voice projecting the warm, respectful authority of a suburban patriarch. "Is there a problem?" The lead deputy kept his hand resting near his duty belt. "We received a report of a break-in at this address. The property owner stated the security panel was destroyed. We need you to step outside and identify yourselves." Thomas let out a deep, exasperated sigh, stepping onto the porch with his hands clearly visible. "Officer, I apologize for the confusion. I am Thomas, and this is my wife, Brenda. The property owner is our daughter, Caroline. We just drove in from Chicago, and there has been a terrible family misunderstanding." He gestured toward the shattered alarm panel visible in the hallway. "I am so embarrassed about that. The keypad was malfunctioning when we arrived. I tried to reset it, and I accidentally pulled the casing right off the wall. I am not very good with modern technology. I will gladly pay for the repairs." The deputy frowned, stepping inside the foyer to inspect the damage. "The property owner claims you have no authorization to be here. She reported this as a criminal trespass." Thomas shook his head, adopting a look of profound paternal sadness. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was building his narrative. "My daughter and I recently had a falling out over a business matter," Thomas explained smoothly, handing the folder to the officer. "She is acting out of anger. But we are not trespassers. We are tenants. We have a verbal lease agreement, allowing us to reside here for the winter season. I brought documentation to prove it." I zoomed in on the camera feed. Thomas was handing the deputy a stack of printed papers. I knew exactly what they were. They were fraudulent records. He had printed out a generic lease template filled in our names and attached printed receipts of random financial transfers he had made to me over the past year. Those small transfers had been repayments for his own cell phone bill, which I had kept on my corporate family plan. But to a patrol officer looking at paper records at 2 in the morning, they looked exactly like rent payments. The deputy reviewed the papers, his expression shifting from suspicious to annoyed. He turned his radio on and stepped back onto the porch. "Dispatch, get the property owner back on the line." My cell phone rang almost immediately. I answered it, confirming my identity. "Mom, we are on the scene," the deputy said, his tone decidedly less urgent than before. "The individuals inside have identified themselves as your parents. They have presented us with documentation showing regular financial transfers to your accounts and are claiming tenancy under a verbal lease agreement. They also have their personal belongings moved into the bedrooms." "They are not tenants," I stated firmly. "The money transfers were for a phone bill. They broke into my house and destroyed the security system. I want them arrested for breaking and entering." "I understand you are frustrated, ma'am," the deputy replied, sounding like he was reciting a manual. "But they have established physical presence. They have their clothing inside, they have keys to the front door, and they have produced paperwork claiming a financial relationship with you regarding residency. That paperwork is fabricated." I argued, though I already knew the grim reality of the situation. They forced their way in. "Whether the agreement is valid or not is for a judge to decide," the deputy stated. "Under the law, once someone establishes residency and presents a credible claim of tenancy, we cannot execute a criminal trespass arrest. We cannot forcibly remove them tonight. This is no longer a criminal matter, it is a civil dispute." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "You are telling me they can smash my property, break into my house, and you are going to leave them there?" "My hands are tied, Mom." The law is very strict regarding tenant rights and squatter protections. If you want them removed, you will have to go to the county courthouse and file a formal eviction notice. I will document the damage to the alarm panel in my report. But as of right now, they have the legal right to remain on the premises. I advise you to contact a real estate attorney in the morning. The deputy hung up. I sat in my office staring at the camera feed. The officers handed the folder back to Thomas, tipped their hats, and walked back to their cruisers. They drove away, leaving my parents standing victorious in the foyer of my home. The red and blue lights faded into the dark, snowy night. Thomas closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. He turned around and looked at Brenda. She let out a loud, shrill laugh of pure relief, clapping her hands together. Thomas walked over to the kitchen island and picked up his glass of my expensive vintage wine. Then he did exactly what I knew he would do. He walked straight up to the camera mounted in the corner of the living room. He knew I was watching. He knew the police had just given him a golden ticket to stay in my multi-million-dollar home for the next 6 months, while the court system slowly processed an eviction. Thomas stared directly into the lens. His face filled the screen. He raised his wine glass in a mocking toast. A smug, triumphant smile stretched across his face. He mouthed the words "thank you" and took a long, slow sip. The smirk on my father's face through the security feed did not incite rage. It inspired a profound, calculated clarity. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He thought the generic lease documents and his charismatic suburban dad routine had granted him an unbreakable shield of squatters' rights. He assumed I would spend the next 6 months bleeding legal fees in a county courthouse, while he and my mother drank my wine and slept in my custom beds. I did not throw my phone. I did not shed a single tear. I simply picked up my secondary line and dialed my attorney. Mitchell is a legal shark who specializes in high-stakes real estate law and white-collar defense. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I gave Mitchell a clinical rundown of the situation. I explained the forced entry, the destroyed alarm panel, the fake lease agreement, and the deputy's refusal to execute a criminal trespass. Mitchell let out a low, dry laugh that echoed through the receiver. He told me that Thomas was playing a checkers strategy on a chessboard. Squatters' rights and tenant protections in Nevada are certainly strict when dealing with private residential landlords. However, those protections evaporate entirely when a property presents an immediate catastrophic threat to human health and safety. We did not need an eviction notice. We needed an environmental emergency. Mitchell outlined a flawlessly ruthless legal maneuver. A month prior, I had established an anonymous Nevada-based limited liability company for tax optimization purposes. Mitchell instructed me to immediately execute a quitclaim deed transferring the full ownership of the Lake Tahoe property from my personal name directly into the LLC. The moment the property became a corporate asset, the rules of engagement shifted completely. As the managing member of the LLC, I had the authority to order an emergency property inspection. Mitchell had a contact at a highly accredited private environmental testing firm. They would issue an immediate hazard declaration citing the presence of severe toxic black mold within the central HVAC system and the internal wall structures. Under state safety and building codes, a property deemed a severe biohazard must be completely and immediately vacated. More importantly, to prevent the spread of toxic spores through the ventilation and municipal water lines, all utility services must be severed by law. It completely bypasses tenant protections because the shutoff is classified as a mandatory public health quarantine rather than a retaliatory landlord action. 48 hours later, the trap was fully armed. The property deed was officially registered under the anonymous LLC. The hazardous mold remediation notice was filed with the county health department and local law enforcement. I personally contacted the regional utility providers. Because I possessed a verified biohazard emergency mandate, the responses were instantaneous. The power company cut the main grid connection to the property. The water authority shut off the street-level valve and locked it. The gas company remotely disabled the heating supply. It was Tuesday evening. A massive winter storm was hammering the Sierra Nevada mountains, dumping heavy snow across the region. The temperature outside the cabin plummeted to a bitter 15 degrees. I sat in my warm Chicago office, monitoring the live feed from my battery-powered backup cameras. I watched Brenda and Thomas sitting in the living room. They were completely unaware of the legal guillotine poised above their heads. At exactly 6 in the evening, the cabin went pitch black. The heavy glow of the chandeliers vanished. The low hum of the central heating unit ground to a halt. I watched through the infrared night vision lenses as Thomas jumped up from the sofa. He flicked the light switches frantically. Nothing happened. He marched into the kitchen and turned the faucet. The pipes let out a hollow groan, but not a single drop of water fell. Brenda wrapped her arms around herself as the brutal mountain cold immediately began to seep through the massive glass windows. Thomas pulled out his cell phone, furiously dialing the local utility companies. I could see the visible puff of his breath in the freezing air as he yelled at the operators. The operators calmly informed him that a state-mandated biohazard quarantine was active on the property and services could not be restored until a commercial remediation team cleared the structure. Panic finally set in. Thomas dialed the police dispatch, demanding they arrest the landlord for an illegal utility shutoff. He thought his fake lease would save him again. 30 minutes later, the same two deputies arrived at the property. Thomas rushed out onto the snow-covered porch, shivering violently in his thin sweater. He pointed wildly at the dark house, demanding justice. The lead deputy looked at his dispatch tablet and shook his head. The deputy informed my father that the property was now owned by a commercial LLC. He explained that there was an active health department quarantine on the structure due to toxic mold. The deputy delivered the final crushing blow. He told Thomas that the utility shutoff was a legal safety mandate. In fact, remaining inside a quarantined biohazard zone was a direct violation of municipal health codes. If my parents did not evacuate the premises immediately, they would be arrested not for trespassing, but for violating a public health order. Their fraudulent lease agreement was completely useless against an environmental emergency. Brenda burst into tears. She grabbed her heavy designer coat, crying uncontrollably as the freezing wind whipped snow across the porch. Thomas stood there, his mouth opening and closing as his entire strategy disintegrated into dust. He had tried to manipulate the legal system to steal my home, and I had used that exact same system to freeze him out. They had zero leverage and zero options. I watched the infrared feed as my parents gathered their black trash bags in the pitch dark. They stumbled down the icy front steps, slipping and sliding in the deep snow. They dragged their miserable belongings back to their battered rental car. They climbed inside, desperately turning on the engine just to run the heater. The headlights clicked on, cutting through the raging blizzard. I watched their car slowly back out of my driveway and disappear into the dark, unforgiving Nevada winter night. They were homeless, freezing, and utterly defeated. I smiled, taking a sip of my wine, and prepared for the next phase of my plan. The morning after my parents were forced into the freezing Nevada snowstorm, I walked into Mitchell's downtown Chicago law office. The victory at Lake Tahoe was satisfying, but it was only a preliminary skirmish. My parents were temporarily neutralized, homeless, and financially ruined. But the core insult remained unresolved. Stephanie and Donovan were still living in the $800,000 estate that I had single-handedly saved from the auction block. They were sleeping in the master bedroom, hosting lavish dinner parties for their influencer friends, and pretending they had achieved the American dream through their own hard work. It was time to pull the rug completely out from under their counterfeit reality. I sat across from Mitchell at his massive glass conference table. The panoramic view of the Chicago River stretched out behind him, but my focus was entirely on the thick stack of manila folders resting between us. Mitchell wore his usual impeccably tailored suit, his expression sharp and alert. He already knew why I was there. I did not just want to evict my sister and her fraudster husband. I wanted to liquidate the entire asset. I wanted to sell the Chicago estate to the highest bidder, take my equity, and leave them with absolutely nothing. Mitchell opened the first folder and adjusted his glasses. He looked at me with a steady, calculating gaze. "Caroline, if we are going to force a partition sale on a residential property, We need to establish your exact legal standing on the original title. I know you have been paying the mortgage for 72 months, but paying the debt does not automatically grant you ownership rights in the eyes of the state. I smiled, leaning back in my leather chair. My parents always assumed I was just a dutiful daughter, handing over my paycheck out of blind loyalty and guilt. They thought I was paying their debts because I was afraid of the family losing face in the neighborhood. But I am a wealth management consultant. My entire career is built on assessing risk, securing collateral, and protecting assets from toxic liabilities. I do not throw $250,000 into a sinking ship without holding the steering wheel. I reached across the table and tapped the thickest folder in the stack. Open the property records from 6 years ago, Mitchell. Look at the date when the bank was exactly 60 days away from initiating the foreclosure proceedings. Mitchell flipped through the documents, his eyes scanning the densely typed legal jargon. He pulled out a specific contract printed on heavy bond paper and bearing the official seal of the county recorder's office. A slow, appreciative grin spread across his face as he read the stipulations. 6 years ago, when Thomas and Brenda came crying to my apartment begging for a financial bailout, I gave them an absolute ultimatum. I told them I would cover the past due balance. I told them I would assume the monthly payments of $3,500. I told them I would pay the property taxes and cover the structural maintenance. But in exchange, I demanded tangible equity. I forced them to sign a warranty deed, adding my name directly to the property title as a legal co-owner. I did not hide it in the fine print. I sat them down at a table with a licensed attorney and made them sign the documents in blue ink. They were so desperate to avoid the public humiliation of a bank foreclosure that they signed away half their ownership rights without a second thought. They gladly traded their equity for my cash flow. Mitchell set the warranty deed down on the glass table. According to this registered filing, you hold a 50% undivided interest in the Chicago estate as a joint tenant. This is not a gentleman's agreement, Caroline. This is an airtight, registered legal fact. You are a verified legal owner of the property. Exactly, I replied, keeping my voice cold and precise. Thomas and Brenda never truly owned that house outright. They only owned half of it. The other half belongs to me. That is why their little performance at the wedding was so utterly absurd. Thomas stood on a stage and told 300 people he was gifting a debt-free estate to Stephanie and Donovan. He gave away a house that was heavily mortgaged and legally co-owned by the very daughter sitting silently in the back of the room. Mitchell tapped his pen against the table, his legal mind already connecting the dots. He looked at the warranty deed and then pulled up the county property database on his laptop. He typed rapidly, navigating through the public records portal to verify the current status of the Chicago estate. If you are a 50% legal owner, Caroline, then we have an incredibly massive problem here, Mitchell said, his tone shifting from appreciative to deeply concerned. He turned the laptop screen toward me so I could see the digital records. I leaned forward, inspecting the screen. The county database showed the most recent transaction history for the property. It displayed the exact quitclaim deed my mother had bragged about in the bridal suite. It showed that the property ownership had been transferred entirely from Thomas and Brenda directly into Stephanie's name. Donovan was also listed as a secondary owner due to their marital status. The county had officially registered the young couple as the sole owners of the $800,000 estate. That is legally impossible, I stated, feeling a sharp thrill of anticipation coursing through my veins. A quitclaim deed only transfers the interest that the grantor actually holds. My parents could only legally transfer their 50% stake to Stephanie. They cannot transfer my 50% stake without my explicit, notarized consent. My name has to be on that transfer document. I have to sign away my ownership rights for Stephanie to be listed as the sole legal owner of the property. Mitchell nodded, his expression turning deadly serious. He clicked a button on his laptop requesting a digital copy of the specific quitclaim deed that had been filed with the county clerk the week before the wedding. We waited in silence as the high-resolution document downloaded and appeared on the screen. We both leaned in to examine the signatures at the bottom of the page. There was my father's messy scrawl. There was my mother's elegant cursive. And right below their names on the designated line for the co-owner was my signature. It was written in black ink, bold and clear. It looked exactly like the signature I used on my corporate contracts and banking authorizations. I stared at the screen, feeling the cold reality of their actions locking into place. I had not signed that document. I had never seen that document in my entire life. I had never authorized the transfer of my equity to my spoiled sister and her scammer husband. I had never willingly surrendered $250,000 in real estate assets. I looked up at Mitchell. The silence in the room was absolute. The game had just escalated from a toxic family dispute over money into something entirely different. We were no longer dealing with greedy parents trying to leverage their daughter's bank account. We were dealing with a coordinated criminal conspiracy. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I sat back in my chair, my mind rapidly processing the catastrophic legal implications of what I was looking at. The victory at Lake Tahoe was child's play compared to the destruction I was about to unleash upon them now. The glow of Mitchell's laptop screen illuminated the dark wood of his conference table. I leaned closer to the monitor. My eyes traced the curves and sharp angles of the signature at the bottom of the quitclaim deed. It was my name. The loops of the letters mimicked my handwriting with terrifying accuracy. Someone had spent hours practicing the exact pressure and slant of my signature. But it was a fake. I knew it instantly. I pointed to the tail end of the last letter. I never drag the ink downward. I always flick it upward. This is a forgery. Mitchell did not blink. He simply zoomed in on the high-resolution scan. Forging a signature on a birthday card is a petty family dispute. Forging a signature on a legal document transferring a massive real estate asset is a profound escalation. My parents had not just lied to me. They had not just manipulated me. They had committed a premeditated criminal act. Thomas and Brenda had sat in a room, looked at a piece of paper worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and deliberately signed my name to steal my equity. They handed my blood and sweat over to Stephanie and Donovan so they could play house. Mitchell adjusted his glasses. A signature alone cannot transfer a deed. He explained, his voice deadly serious. Real estate law requires strict authentication. Someone had to verify that you physically stood in front of them, handed over your government-issued identification, and signed this document under your own free will. He scrolled the document down to the bottom right corner. There, pressed firmly into the digital scan, was a circular black ink stamp, the seal of a licensed notary public. Mitchell read the name on the stamp aloud. He opened a new tab on his browser and accessed the state licensing database. I watched his fingers fly across the keyboard. Within 2 minutes, we had a profile. The notary operated out of a run-down strip mall on the outskirts of the Chicago suburbs. He offered check cashing services, bail bonds, and quick tax returns. He was not a high-end legal professional. He was a guy struggling to make rent. He was exactly the kind of desperate individual Thomas could walk up to with an envelope of cash. My father was a salesman by trade. He knew how to talk to people who needed money. He likely walked into that strip mall, handed over a few $100 bills, and spun a sob story about a busy daughter who could not make it into the office to sign some trivial family paperwork. Or maybe he just offered enough cash that the notary simply looked the other way and stamped the document without asking any questions at all. Either way, the notary had officially verified a phantom. He had authenticated a ghost. I looked at Mitchell. What exactly are we looking at here from a prosecution standpoint? I wanted to hear the full weight of the law spoken aloud. I needed to quantify the exact amount of destruction my parents had just invited into their lives. Mitchell folded his hands together, resting them on the table. We are looking at a multi-count federal indictment, Caroline. This is not a civil misunderstanding. This is title fraud. By filing a forged deed with the county clerk's office, they committed perjury and public record fraud. By transferring an asset worth nearly $1 million across state lines or through digital banking portals, they likely triggered wire fraud. The notary will lose his license and face jail time for falsifying official documents. But your parents? He paused, letting the gravity of the situation settle in the room. Your parents are looking at conspiracy to commit fraud and grand theft. In the state of Illinois and under federal jurisdiction, these are high-level felonies. If convicted, they are not looking at probation. They are looking at a mandatory minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 10 years in federal prison. I let the words wash over me. A normal daughter might have felt a sudden surge of panic or heartbreak. A normal daughter might have burst into tears at the thought of her aging parents wearing prison jumpsuits. But I had spent 72 months acting as their financial shield. I had given them every opportunity to live comfortably and honorably. Instead, they chose to orchestrate a felony just to ensure their golden child could continue living a life of unearned luxury. They risked federal prison just to spite me. The betrayal was so absolute it severed the final invisible thread of familial obligation tying me to them. They were no longer my mother and father. They were hostile actors who had stolen my assets. I felt an exhilarating sense of freedom. I was no longer bound by guilt or duty. The gloves were entirely off. "We need to contact the county recorder's office immediately," Mitchell said, reaching for his desk phone. "We will file an emergency affidavit of forgery. I will draft a cease and desist order to Stephanie and Donovan. We will notify the local authorities and the FBI field office about the fraudulent transfer. We can have this deed reversed and frozen by the end of the week." I placed my hand firmly over his. "Stop. Do not file the affidavit yet. Do not call the police." Mitchell stared at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Caroline, this is an active crime. They stole your house. If we do not report it immediately, they could attempt to sell the property or leverage it. We need to lock down the title right now before they do any more damage. I know exactly what they are going to do, Mitchell. That is why we are going to wait." I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling city. I pictured Donovan sitting in my house, pretending to be a brilliant technology executive. I thought about Stephanie posting videos online about her beautiful debt-free home. "Think about who we are dealing with," I said, turning back to face my lawyer. "Donovan is a fake startup founder who desperately needs capital to fund his non-existent cryptocurrency ventures. Stephanie is an influencer who burns through cash to maintain an illusion of wealth. Right now, they believe they hold the free and clear title to an $800,000 estate. What does a scammer do when he suddenly gains access to a massive, unencumbered asset? He leverages it." Mitchell's eyes widened as he caught the trajectory of my thoughts. He slowly lowered the phone back onto its receiver. "You think he is going to apply for a home equity line of credit?" "I guarantee it," I replied. "Donovan does not want to live a quiet suburban life. He wants fast liquid cash to throw around. He is going to march into a major bank, hand them that fraudulent quitclaim deed, and use my house as collateral to pull out hundreds of thousands of dollars in a cash loan. He will try to drain the equity dry. And if he does that," Mitchell murmured, a dark smile creeping onto his face, "he commits bank fraud. A completely separate and exponentially more severe federal crime." "Exactly," I said, walking back to the table and tapping the forged document on the screen. "If we strike now, my parents get arrested for forging a deed, but Stephanie and Donovan get to play the innocent victims. They will claim they had no idea the deed was fake. They will cry to the judge and walk away clean. But if we let Donovan take that fraudulent deed into a federally insured bank and sign his name on a $500,000 loan application, he becomes a direct participant in the crime. He crosses the line from an obnoxious freeloader into a federal bank defrauder." I instructed Mitchell to quietly place a cloud on the title. Not a public lawsuit, just a highly discreet legal mechanism hidden deep within the National Real Estate Registry. It would act as a silent tripwire. The moment a bank underwriter attempted to finalize a loan against that property, the system would flag it. We would not just catch them stealing a house. We would catch them attempting to defraud a major financial institution. We were going to let their insatiable greed build the very gallows they would hang from. I told Mitchell to prepare the paperwork and keep his finger hovering over the trigger. We were going to let Donovan walk right into the bank and sign his own death warrant. I stepped out of the polished glass doors of Mitchell's law firm and out into the biting Chicago wind. The freezing temperature outside perfectly matched the sudden absolute chill running through my own veins. I got into the back of my waiting town car, giving the driver the address to my penthouse. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, I did not cry. I did not feel the familiar suffocating weight of a daughter's heartbreak or the sting of parental rejection. Instead, my mind initiated a cold, methodical audit of the past 72 months. I leaned my head against the leather seat and traced the timeline backwards. 6 years ago, Thomas and Brenda sat weeping on my pristine living room sofa, begging for salvation from a looming bank foreclosure. I remembered the exact shade of my mother's desperation. I remembered my father's trembling hands. It had been a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. They had readily signed that warranty deed, granting me 50% equity with smiles of profound gratitude and tears of relief. Now the math finally made sense. They had never viewed that signature as a binding legal contract. To them, my name on the deed was just a temporary administrative hurdle. It was a small, meaningless price to pay to secure a permanent free ATM. I thought about Stephanie. From the moment she was born, she was the undisputed center of their universe. She possessed the superficial charm and complete lack of accountability that my parents thrived on. She played the role of the perfect dependent daughter, allowing Brenda and Thomas to feel essential and powerful. I, on the other hand, was too independent, too analytical, and too intimidating. My financial success was an unspoken indictment of their own constant failures. They resented my wealth, but felt absolutely entitled to consume it. They saw my high income not as a product of my grueling 80-hour workweeks, but as a communal family resource to be harvested exclusively for Stephanie's benefit. And then came Donovan. When Stephanie brought him home flaunting his rented designer suits and pitching his hollow cryptocurrency startup, my parents were utterly captivated. He spoke their exact language of unearned luxury and effortless status. They wanted so desperately to be part of the tech billionaire narrative he was spinning to their country club friends. But Donovan had no actual capital. He needed a stage to perform on. He needed a physical manifestation of wealth to validate his fraudulent empire and secure his influencer wife's lifestyle. My parents recognized that their heavily mortgaged, decaying financial state would eventually expose them to this golden son-in-law. So they hatched a plan to secure the ultimate prop for Donovan and Stephanie. The sheer premeditation of the forgery was what eradicated the last lingering remnants of my empathy. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment driven by a sudden panic. This was a sustained, calculated conspiracy. They had to research how to bypass a co-owner on a property title. They had to seek out a desperate corrupt notary in a rundown strip mall far from their neighborhood. They had to sit at a table, look at a legal document, and carefully, deliberately mimic the loops and slants of my signature. They practiced stealing from me. They rehearsed it. They committed a federal felony with steady hands, entirely convinced that my familial duty would prevent me from ever verifying the title or worse, reporting them to the authorities if I did find out. They had weaponized my loyalty. They had transformed me into a proxy debtor, a silent beast of burden harnessed to a heavy plow, dragging their massive financial liabilities forward while they paraded Stephanie and Donovan around in a golden carriage. For 6 years, every time I transferred $3,500, I thought I was preserving my family's dignity and keeping a roof over their heads. In reality, I was simply funding my own robbery. I was maintaining the pristine credit score required for them to eventually execute a massive theft. Sitting in the quiet darkness of the car, I felt a fundamental shift in my psychological architecture. The societal programming that dictates a child must infinitely forgive their parents evaporated into the night air, leaving behind a sharp, frictionless void. Brenda and Thomas ceased to be my mother and father. They were downgraded to hostile liabilities. Stephanie and Donovan were no longer annoying relatives. They were unauthorized occupants holding stolen assets. I am a wealth management executive who specializes in dismantling toxic corporate structures and liquidating bad investments. I destroy financial parasites for a living. It was time to bring my professional expertise home. Any lingering desire to confront them, to scream at them, or to demand an apology vanished completely. Explanations were for people who still cared about repairing a broken relationship. I only cared about asset recovery and maximum punitive damage. They had chosen to play a high-stakes game of real estate fraud to fund a fake lifestyle for a fraudulent tech CEO. I was going to let them play. I was going to let them walk right into the casino place, all their stolen chips on the table, and then I was going to lock the doors and burn the entire building down around them. The car pulled up to my high-rise building. I stepped out into the freezing night feeling lighter and more dangerous than I ever had in my life. I walked past the concierge with a polite nod, stepping into the private elevator. By the time the doors opened to my penthouse, my plan was fully solidified. I would not say a single word to any of them. I would sit back, watch them bask in their stolen glory, and wait for Donovan's insatiable greed to trigger the federal trap I had just laid. The psychology of a thief dictates that they can never stop at just one crime. They always reach for more. And I was going to make sure that his next reach would be his absolute last. I walked back into Mitchell's office at 8 sharp the next morning. The skyline of Chicago was hidden behind a thick layer of gray winter clouds, but the fluorescent lights of his conference room were blindingly bright. Mitchell already had the paperwork spread out across the glass table. He had drafted a formal complaint for the state attorney's office outlining the forged signature, the corrupt notary, and the fraudulent transfer of the deed. He had his phone resting on top of the files, ready to make the call to the local authorities and the fraud division. "Caroline, we can have warrants issued by tomorrow afternoon," Mitchell said, leaning forward. "The county prosecutor will love this. It is a clear-cut case of real estate fraud. Thomas and Brenda will be taken into custody and the transfer will be nullified. We get your equity back immediately." I sat down across from him and looked at the neatly typed complaint. I reached out and pushed the stack of papers back toward him. "Throw it in the shredder," I said, my voice completely flat. "We are not calling the police. We are not calling the state attorney. We are not doing anything that alerts them." Mitchell stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He adjusted his glasses, looking from the papers to my face. "Caroline, they committed a felony. They stole $250,000 of your equity. If we do not report this right now, they could try to sell the estate." I shook my head. "They are not going to sell it, Mitchell. Selling it takes time. Selling it means packing up and moving. Stephanie is currently filming house tour videos for her followers, pretending she is a young, affluent homeowner who achieved the American dream. Donovan is hosting lavish dinners, playing the role of a highly successful startup founder. They are completely intoxicated by the illusion of their new wealth. But illusions cost money to maintain. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold glass table. Think about Donovan's psychological profile. He is a smooth-talking scammer pushing a fake cryptocurrency platform. He has no venture capital. He has no actual revenue. He has been surviving on credit cards and my parents' misguided generosity. Right now, he is desperate for liquid cash to keep his startup charade alive and to fund Stephanie's expensive aesthetic. And suddenly he believes he is holding the free and clear deed to an $800,000 property. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he began to see the outline of my strategy. "A con artist with an unencumbered asset will not sit on it," I continued. "He will leverage it. He is going to walk into a major financial institution, hand them that forged quitclaim deed, and apply for a massive loan. He will try to pull out hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to fund his phantom company and buy his luxury cars. If we arrest my parents today for forgery," I explained, "my parents take the fall. Stephanie cries on her social media channels, claiming she is a victim of a tragic family misunderstanding. Donovan walks away with his hands clean, insisting he was just an innocent beneficiary of a wedding gift gone wrong. They escape without a single scratch. I do not want them to escape. I want Donovan to put his own signature on a fraudulent federal loan application." Mitchell let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. He saw the sheer magnitude of the trap I was building. If Donovan uses a forged property deed to secure a bank loan, he commits federal bank fraud and wire fraud. He triggers an automatic FBI investigation. Exactly, I said. But if we let him walk into a bank, we need a safety net to ensure he does not actually run off with the bank's money using my house as collateral. We need a silent tripwire. I instructed Mitchell to file a very specific legal instrument known as a cloud on title. It is a formal notice of an unresolved dispute regarding the ownership of a property. We would not file a loud public lawsuit that would alert Stephanie or Donovan. Instead, Mitchell would lodge a quiet, highly discreet dispute directly into the National and County Real Estate Registry. It would sit there completely invisible to anyone simply looking at the surface-level tax records. Stephanie could continue boasting online, and Donovan could continue playing the wealthy CEO without ever knowing the landmine was buried right beneath their feet. But the moment Donovan sat down with a federal bank underwriter to finalize a home equity loan, the bank would run a deep institutional title search. The banking software would immediately hit the cloud on title. The system would flag the severe discrepancy in the ownership chain. The bank would instantly detect that the collateral being offered was highly contested and likely fraudulent. Mitchell pulled a fresh legal pad toward him, picking up his gold pen. You want me to bury a silent dispute in the county records? He confirmed, a sharp smile forming on his lips. You want to wait for him to initiate a federal financial transaction. And the moment the bank flags the application, we submit our evidence directly to the federal authorities. I nodded. We let them think they have outsmarted everyone. We let Donovan dream about his $500,000 cash injection. We sit back in total silence, and we wait for the prey to walk willingly into the slaughterhouse. Mitchell began drafting the cloud on title notice right then and there. His pen scratched rhythmically against the paper, sealing the fate of the people who thought they could use me as their personal stepping stone. I left the law office feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. The board was set. The pieces were locked into place. I went back to my high-rise apartment, poured a cup of black coffee, and opened my laptop. I logged into an anonymous social media account and navigated to Stephanie's page. She was already posting videos of herself standing in the sprawling kitchen of the Chicago estate, talking about her big plans for interior renovations. In the background, Donovan was pacing around the living room, talking loudly on his phone, pitching his fake crypto project to whoever was gullible enough to listen. They looked so incredibly happy. They looked invincible. They had absolutely no idea that they were dancing on top of a legal graveyard. I closed the laptop, taking a sip of my dark coffee. All I had to do now was wait. The trap was armed, and Donovan's relentless greed would do the rest. 3 weeks went by. The initial euphoria of the grand wedding had finally begun to fade, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of maintaining an $800,000 estate. Heating a sprawling Chicago home in the dead of winter is not cheap. Property maintenance, landscaping, and the sheer cost of keeping up appearances were quickly draining whatever cash gifts Stephanie and Donovan had hoarded from their lavish reception. But more importantly, Donovan was running out of time. A fake cryptocurrency CEO cannot survive without a steady stream of capital to project the illusion of overwhelming success. I sat in my downtown office, sipping my morning espresso, watching their lives unfold through the glowing screen of my tablet. Stephanie documented every single second of their existence on her social media platforms. She posted endless videos of herself wandering through the massive living room, holding a steaming mug of artisanal coffee, bragging to her followers about the joys of debt-free homeownership. She filmed Donovan sitting at my father's old mahogany study desk, wearing a sleek turtleneck, shouting aggressively into his phone about blockchain algorithms and decentralized finance protocols. It was a spectacular, highly produced theatrical performance. But behind the camera lens, the financial desperation was becoming palpable. Donovan had no venture capital backing. His supposed tech startup was nothing more than a registered domain name and a poorly coded landing page. He needed liquid cash to fund his ongoing charade, and he needed it immediately. He could not attract gullible investors if he was driving a standard sedan and unable to pick up the tab at high-end steakhouses. He needed the ultimate prop to solidify his fake billionaire persona. He needed a luxury vehicle, specifically a brand new Porsche Macan, and a massive infusion of operational capital to keep his scam afloat. I knew exactly how his mind worked. I had dismantled dozens of fraudulent executives just like him in my career. When a con artist is backed into a corner, they do not scale back. They double down. And Donovan had just been handed the ultimate financial trump card. He believed he was sitting on top of $800,000 of completely unencumbered, easily accessible equity. I listened to the audio of a live stream Stephanie hosted on her channel, piecing together the exact narrative Donovan was feeding her. He was an absolute master of manipulation. He did not tell her they were running out of money. Instead, he framed his desperate cash grab as a visionary business strategy. I could hear him in the background of her video pacing the hardwood floors, feeding her the exact financial buzzwords he had memorized from internet forums. He told her that keeping $800,000 locked up in a physical house was a terrible financial mistake. He called it dead equity. Dead. He spun a brilliant, intoxicating web of lies, convincing my sister that wealthy people do not just sit on paid-off real estate. Wealthy people leverage their assets. He explained that if they took out a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC, they could easily extract $500,000 in pure, untaxed cash. Donovan pitched it as the ultimate power move. He told Stephanie that he would inject the $500,000 directly into his crypto startup, scale the platform globally, and multiply the money tenfold within a year. They would pay back the bank loan with the massive profits and keep the rest. And to ensure he looked like a legitimate, thriving tech founder when pitching to elite venture capitalists, he insisted they needed to purchase a fully loaded Porsche Macan. He framed a $90,000 luxury SUV not as a frivolous expense, but as a mandatory corporate marketing tool. Stephanie swallowed the bait without a single moment of hesitation. She possessed absolutely zero financial literacy. She had spent her entire life being shielded from the consequences of debt by my parents, and then, later, by my silent mortgage payments. She did not understand collateral variable interest rates or the catastrophic risk of leveraging a primary residence for a highly volatile, non-existent business venture. She only heard the words $500,000 in cash and a brand new Porsche. Her social media feeds instantly reflected this new delusion of grandeur. She began posting mood boards featuring luxury car interiors and talking cryptically to her followers about a massive upcoming venture capital expansion. She boasted that her brilliant husband was about to disrupt the entire financial tech industry. She was completely intoxicated by the prospect of becoming the wealthy wife of a Silicon Valley-style titan. They moved with astonishing speed, driven by Donovan's insatiable, bottomless greed. They did not go to a small local credit union. Donovan's ego demanded the prestige of a major, federally insured national bank. He wanted to walk into a towering glass financial institution in downtown Chicago, slap that forged quitclaim deed onto a loan officer's desk, and demand a $500,000 cash injection based on the sheer value of the estate. I watched Stephanie post a video of herself sitting in the passenger seat of their car. She was holding a thick manila folder, her freshly manicured nails tapping excitedly against the cardboard. She giggled into the camera, whispering to her audience that she and her husband were heading to a very important executive banking meeting to secure funding for their next massive life upgrade. Donovan was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. He looked incredibly confident, flashing a brilliant, arrogant smile at the lens. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the entire world. He believed he had stolen my house, humiliated my parents, and secured his own financial independence in one flawless, untouchable sweep. I locked my tablet screen and set it down on my pristine desk. A cold, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. They were driving straight into the heart of the financial district, clutching a piece of paper that was forged by a corrupt strip mall notary, entirely convinced it was their golden ticket to a $500,000 payday. They had absolutely no idea that a silent, invisible tripwire was waiting for them the moment they handed that folder to a federal underwriter. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the devastating mechanism of federal law was about to snap their entire world in half. Mitchell poured 2 cups of dark roast coffee from the French press in his corner office. He handed one to me without saying a word. We sat in his spacious conference room with the gray Chicago skyline looming behind the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. On his sleek monitor, a highly specialized legal portal was open. As a real estate attorney dealing with high-stakes property disputes, Mitchell utilized software that directly tracked county deed registries and financial inquiries tied to specific addresses. We were not just guessing what my sister and her husband were doing. We were watching the financial gears turn in real time. The status of the Chicago estate had just updated in the National Registry. A major federally insured bank had officially initiated the underwriting process for a $500,000 home equity line of credit. Donovan had actually done it. He had taken the forged quit-claim deed, marched into a corporate bank branch, and formally applied to drain $500,000 of equity out of a house he did not legally own. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened my social media applications. Stephanie was currently broadcasting their supposed financial genius to the entire internet. She had just uploaded a 20-minute video to her lifestyle channel. I turned the volume up slightly so Mitchell could hear the sheer delusion radiating from the device. Stephanie was sitting in the driver's seat of a showroom model Porsche Macan at a high-end luxury dealership. She ran her manicured hands over the premium leather steering wheel, flashing her diamond rings at the camera. Her caption displayed in bold letters declaring that when your husband is a tech visionary, you do not have to wait for the things you want. She looked directly into the lens and began delivering a deeply condescending monologue about financial independence. "I just do not understand people who slave away in corporate cubicles," Stephanie said, her tone dripping with toxic pity. She flipped her hair over her shoulder, leaning back into the expensive leather seat. "People who work 80-hour weeks, making someone else rich, while waiting for a meager paycheck. It is such a sad, limited way to live. They have no freedom. They have no vision. You have to be smart in this economy. You have to make your money work for you. You have to understand how to leverage your generational assets instead of just being a miserable wage earner." She was talking directly about me. She was calling me a sad, limited wage earner while she was preparing to buy a $90,000 luxury vehicle using money stolen through a federal felony. She was actively mocking the very career that had funded the roof over her head for the past 6 years. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle in my chest. Mitchell shook his head in absolute disbelief. He looked at the phone screen where my sister was now showing off the custom trim options Donovan was selecting for the Porsche. "The sheer arrogance is staggering," Mitchell said quietly, taking his own sip of coffee. "They are actively documenting their own financial crimes on a public platform. They are leaving a digital trail of their intent to spend stolen funds." "Let her speak," I replied, locking my phone screen and setting it face down on the glass table. Every single video she posts establishes a concrete timeline. It proves they are willing participants in the fraud. They cannot claim ignorance later. They are not victims of our parents' bad decisions. They are eager, enthusiastic beneficiaries of a criminal conspiracy. I turned my attention back to Mitchell's computer monitor. The loan application was moving rapidly through the banking machinery. Federal underwriting is a rigorous, unforgiving process. A major bank does not just hand over $500,000 in cash because a man in a tailored suit smiles nicely and uses tech buzzwords. They verify everything. The loan processor had already accepted their initial application. The next step was the automated valuation model to confirm the estate was actually worth the $800,000 they claimed. A green notification light appeared on the tracking software. The banking algorithm confirmed the property value. Donovan had clearly polished his fake business portfolio to absolute perfection. He must have provided the loan officer with fabricated revenue projections for his cryptocurrency startup to justify his ability to repay the massive monthly loan installments. The bank temporarily accepted his fraudulent income statements. They accepted the pristine property history that I had personally maintained and paid for, which was now magically associated with Donovan's name. "The initial review is complete," Mitchell noted, pointing his pen at the monitor. "The loan has officially moved out of the basic processing phase and into the title department. The underwriters are initiating the deep background search on the quitclaim deed." I watched the progress bar on the screen. The bank was now digging heavily into the county real estate records. The underwriters were looking for liens, encumbrances, and the complete ownership history. They were looking for the exact legal chain of custody that Donovan claimed gave him total supreme ownership of the asset. Stephanie uploaded yet another story to her feed. This one was filmed inside the sprawling kitchen of the Chicago estate. She was unboxing expensive crystal glassware and premium champagne flutes. "We are hosting a massive housewarming party this coming weekend," she announced to her followers, her voice echoing in the large room. "Donovan is officially launching his new platform, and we are celebrating our gorgeous new estate with all of our friends and family. I cannot wait to show you guys the final setup. Big things are coming." Big things were indeed coming, but not the kind she was expecting. I set my coffee mug down. The trap was holding perfectly. Donovan and Stephanie were so blinded by the flashing lights of their fake success that they completely ignored the foundational mechanics of corporate banking. When a federal bank prepares to issue a $500,000 loan against a property, they hire professional title examiners. Those examiners do not just glance at a piece of paper signed by a corrupt strip mall notary. They pull the entire historical file. They check every single signature, every KEO owner, and every hidden legal dispute ever registered against the address. Mitchell and I sat in comfortable silence watching the digital gears turn. The banking software was a relentless, emotionless machine. It did not care about Stephanie's influencer aesthetic. It did not care about Donovan's fake CEO persona. It only cared about risk and liability. And the risk associated with that specific piece of Chicago real estate was about to trigger severe alarm bells across the entire federal banking system. The quiet cloud on title that Mitchell had buried deep in the National Registry was waiting in the dark. The bank examiners were currently pulling the files. It was only a matter of time before their automated system collided violently with our hidden legal tripwire. I crossed my legs and smiled, knowing the execution of their downfall was going to be absolutely flawless. It was Thursday morning, exactly 2 days before the massive housewarming party my sister had been relentlessly advertising across the internet. The deadline was closing in. Donovan needed the liquid cash to clear his account before the weekend, to pay the luxury caterers, the bartenders, and the exotic car dealership where he had placed a hold on the $90,000 Porsche Macan. I sat at my desk in Mitchell's law office, a cup of green tea replacing my usual coffee. Mitchell was on a secure conference call with his paralegals, but his eyes remained rigidly fixed on the secondary monitor tracking the National Title Registry. Stephanie uploaded a new photograph to her daily story. She and Donovan were sitting in a sleek, glass-walled conference room at a premier bank branch in downtown Chicago. There were thick stacks of legal papers spread across the polished mahogany table between them. She captioned the image with bold, sparkling text, declaring that they were securing the bag for the next big venture, living the ultimate CEO wife life. I zoomed in on the high-resolution photo. I could literally see the blue ink on the signature line of a federal lending agreement. Donovan was signing his name. He was officially binding himself to a $500,000 home equity line of credit. He was offering a massive real estate asset he did not legally own to a federally insured financial institution. "He is signing the final disclosures," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet office. Mitchell hung up his desk phone and leaned forward, his focus entirely consumed by the tracking software. The digital portal on his screen was refreshing every 30 seconds. Once the ink dries, the closing agent scans the physical packet into the bank's central underwriting system for final disbursement authorization. He explained, his tone clinical and precise. Before they wire $500,000 into a personal checking account, the automated system runs one last absolute verification of the property title. They have to ensure no hidden liens or legal disputes were placed on the property during the 30-day processing window. We watched the screen. The tension in the room was electric, vibrating with the exact sensation of watching a blindfolded predator step directly onto a primed landmine. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Stephanie posted another quick video update showing Donovan confidently shaking hands with a smiling bank executive. They truly thought the deal was done. They believed they had successfully secured their unearned fortune and solidified their fake lifestyle. Suddenly, Mitchell's monitor flashed a harsh, brilliant red alert. A severe warning code popped up on the title tracking software dominating the center of the screen. The bank's massive disbursement algorithm had hit the invisible wall. The automated system had scanned the national registry, bypassed the superficial surface-level tax records my parents had manipulated, and collided violently with the cloud on title dispute I had buried weeks ago. "There it is," Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "The bank just flagged the collateral as highly contested. The automated wire transfer is completely frozen. The system has officially rejected the disbursement." Donovan and Stephanie were likely walking out of the bank lobby at that exact second, completely unaware that the $500,000 they were expecting to see in their account by 5 o'clock was never going to arrive. The bank's internal fraud department was already receiving automated high-priority alerts regarding the severe discrepancy in the ownership chain. But I was not going to leave the destruction of my toxic family to some mid-level corporate bank investigator. I wanted the full, devastating, inescapable power of the federal government. I opened the heavy leather briefcase I had brought with me and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized dossier. I had spent the last several weeks compiling every single piece of evidence with surgical precision. It contained the original notarized warranty deed proving my 50% undivided ownership of the estate. It contained the forged quitclaim deed bearing the corrupt notary stamp that my father had purchased. It contained the certified financial records proving my 72 months of mortgage payments. It contained digital archives of Stephanie's social media videos where Donovan explicitly stated his intent to leverage the stolen property to fund his cryptocurrency startup. And now, thanks to the bank's digital footprint, we possessed the final fatal piece of the puzzle. We had verifiable proof of an attempted federal bank loan using fraudulent collateral. I slid the heavy dossier across the glass table to my attorney. "Send it," I commanded, stripping every ounce of mercy from my voice. Mitchell had a direct, highly placed contact at the FBI field office in Chicago. He worked closely with a senior special agent who specialized in white-collar crime, major financial fraud, and complex real estate theft. Mitchell scanned the final banking alert attaching the digital rejection code to our comprehensive criminal complaint. He typed a brief, highly technical email detailing the exact nature of the interconnected crimes. He outlined the conspiracy to commit fraud orchestrated by my parents, Brenda and Thomas. He outlined the aggravated identity theft related to the forged signature on the state property deed. He outlined the attempted wire fraud for the electronic transfer of $500,000. And finally, he highlighted the most severe charge of all. He detailed the bank fraud committed by Donovan the exact moment he signed a federal loan application, offering a stolen house as collateral. Mitchell hit the send button. The email disappeared from his outbox, flying through encrypted servers directly to the desk of a federal agent. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling streets of the city. The weather was bleak, the sky a bruised, heavy gray, but I felt an overwhelming sense of brilliant, blinding sunlight. The trap had snapped shut with absolute lethal perfection. There was no backing out now. There would be no dramatic family interventions in a suburban living room. There would be no tearful apologies, no desperate pleas for forgiveness, and no chance for my parents to gaslight their way out of the consequences. When the FBI opens a financial fraud investigation involving a federally insured bank, the matter leaves the hands of the victims entirely. The United States Department of Justice becomes the prosecuting entity. My parents could not beg me to drop the charges because I was no longer the one pressing them. I was simply the cooperating witness, providing the evidence. Donovan had desperately wanted to play the role of a high-rolling tech executive. My parents had desperately wanted to play the role of wealthy, benevolent benefactors. Stephanie had wanted to play the role of the envied, untouchable influencer. They had collaborated to build an entire cinematic universe of lies, funded by my stolen equity and maintained by their boundless arrogance. Now the federal government was going to tear down their movie set and arrest the actors. The special agent just confirmed receipt of the dossier, Mitchell said, breaking the heavy silence in the conference room. He was reading a response on his monitor, his eyes scanning the text rapidly. They are reviewing the file immediately. Given the sheer severity of the bank fraud, the multi-jurisdictional nature of the wire transfer attempt, and the crystal-clear paper trail we provided, he expects to secure federal arrest warrants within 48 hours. 48 hours. I did the mental math instantly. That timeline meant the warrants would go live, and the strike teams would be deployed right in the middle of Stephanie and Donovan's extravagant housewarming party. They had invited over 100 guests, including my parents' country club friends, Donovan's fake business associates, and all of Stephanie's superficial influencer connections. They were planning to host the ultimate celebration of their stolen wealth. I smiled, my reflection staring back at me in the cold glass of the window. I felt a profound, chilling sense of peace. It was going to be the most spectacular, unforgettable party our family had ever thrown, and I was going to make sure I had a front row seat to watch their entire empire burn to the ground. Friday afternoon arrived with a crisp, bitter chill across Chicago, but inside the luxury boutiques of the Magnificent Mile, the atmosphere was flushed with arrogant warmth. I sat in my penthouse monitoring the digital updates from Mitchell while simultaneously watching Stephanie broadcast her shopping spree live to her followers. They were operating on the absolute certainty that $500,000 was currently traveling through the federal wire system directly into Donovan's business checking account. Donovan had meticulously planned his triumphant victory lap. He and Stephanie were standing inside an exclusive European watch boutique. The camera angle perfectly captured the velvet display trays and the fluted glasses of complimentary champagne they were sipping. Stephanie was panning the lens across a row of diamond-encrusted timepieces, asking her audience to help her choose the perfect gift for her brilliant tech CEO husband. Donovan stood beside her wearing a bespoke suit, adjusting his cuffs with the exaggerated confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered the financial world. They were spending money they did not actually possess yet, running up the balances on their existing, heavily leveraged credit cards, entirely dependent on the impending bank wire to clear the massive debt. It was the classic fatal flaw of every amateur scammer. They always spend the payout before the ink on the contract actually dries. Back in my office, my secure messaging application chimed. It was a brief, highly encrypted update from Mitchell. The text contained only 2 sentences. The bank initiated the transfer. The federal hold is active. The $500,000 disbursement had officially left the bank's lending reserve. For exactly 1 fraction of a second, the money registered in Donovan's newly created corporate account. The numbers appeared on the ledger, a massive, life-altering sum of cash. But before the banking interface could even send an automated notification to Donovan's smartphone, the federal freeze slammed down like an iron vault door. The FBI had executed the emergency asset freeze order. The entire account, along with every single linked credit line and secondary checking balance under Donovan's social security number, was instantly and completely locked. The funds were classified as evidence in an active federal fraud investigation. The money was there, suspended in a digital purgatory, entirely inaccessible. I turned my attention back to the live video feed. Stephanie was wrapping up her broadcast, announcing that Donovan had made his selection. He was purchasing a solid rose gold chronograph that cost more than most people earn in 2 years. He smiled broadly at the camera, kissing her cheek, telling her followers that hard work and visionary investments always pay off. Then the broadcast abruptly ended. I did not need a camera to know exactly what happened next. I had witnessed the exact same sequence of events dozens of times in my career, when seizing assets from hostile corporate entities. Donovan would have confidently handed his premium credit card to the boutique manager. The manager would have swiped the heavy metal card through the terminal, making polite conversation about the upcoming housewarming party. And then the terminal would have beeped. A sharp, unforgiving, mechanical rejection. I could picture the exact shade of annoyance crossing Donovan's face. He would have chuckled, blaming a routine bank security measure for flagging such a large, out-of-character purchase. He would have casually reached into his designer wallet and produced a second card, perhaps his primary debit card, the one linked directly to the account, expecting the massive equity loan transfer. The manager would swipe the second card. The terminal would beep again. Declined. Error code. Contact issuing bank. The polite, deferential atmosphere of the luxury boutique would instantly evaporate, replaced by a suffocating, heavy awkwardness. The sales associates would exchange knowing glances. Stephanie's smile would falter, her cheeks flushing with sudden intense humiliation. Donovan is a man whose entire identity relies on projecting absolute financial dominance. Being declined for a luxury purchase in front of his influencer wife and a team of high-end retail clerks would feel like a physical assault. He would pull out his smartphone, his fingers flying across the screen as he opened his mobile banking application to prove to the manager that his accounts were flush with cash. But when the application loaded, he would not see a balance. He would see a stark, generic error message instructing him to contact the fraud prevention department immediately. I sat in my quiet, sunlit living room, savoring the absolute poetry of his destruction. Donovan was standing in one of the most expensive retail stores in the city, holding a watch he could not buy, realizing that his financial life support had just been severed. He would walk out of that boutique empty-handed, the complimentary champagne turning to acid in his stomach. He would spend the next 2 hours sitting in the driver's seat of his leased car, frantically dialing customer service numbers, screaming at low-level bank representatives. The representatives would refuse to give him any concrete information. Federal regulations prohibit bank employees from tipping off suspects when an account is frozen under an active FBI investigation. The operators would simply read from a mandated script, telling him his account was under administrative review and no funds could be accessed or dispersed. The panic would begin to consume him. He had caterers arriving tomorrow morning who required final payment. He had a luxury car dealership expecting a wire transfer by the end of the day. He had a massive, sprawling estate to maintain, and he could not even buy a tank of gas. The walls of his elaborate scam were closing in rapidly, squeezing the oxygen out of his lungs. He would likely try to call my parents, demanding to know if there was an issue with the property deed they had given him. Thomas and Brenda would assure him everything was perfectly fine, entirely unaware that their forged signature had just triggered a federal trap. They would all sit in their respective echo chambers of delusion, blaming banking glitches and bureaucratic delays, completely blind to the grim reaper of federal justice standing right behind them. Tomorrow was Saturday, the day of their spectacular housewarming party. They were going to open the doors of my home to over 100 guests, pretending they were the reigning monarchs of Chicago elite society. They would smile, pour cheap wine masked in expensive decanters, and try to hide the crippling financial terror gripping their chests. They had no idea that the guest list had been expanded. They had no idea that the caterers and the influencers were not the only ones planning to attend. I closed my laptop, a deep, resonant calm settling over my entire body. I had a dress to pick out for tomorrow. It was going to be a phenomenal party. Saturday evening descended on the Chicago suburbs with a biting frost, but the estate was radiating heat and blinding light. Valet attendants in crisp vests sprinted down the sweeping driveway, parking lines of luxury sedans and imported sports cars. I stood across the street shrouded in the dark interior of Mitchell's hired town car, watching the spectacle unfold. Stephanie and Donovan had spared absolutely no expense for their grand housewarming gala. A string quartet played in the grand foyer, their elegant notes drifting out every time the heavy oak doors opened to admit another group of affluent guests. My parents were in their absolute element. Through the massive bay windows, I could see Thomas holding a crystal tumbler of bourbon, laughing boisterously with the neighborhood association board members. Brenda was floating between groups of country club wives wearing a sequenced gown, pointing out the architectural details of the home as if she had laid the bricks herself. Stephanie was holding court near the grand staircase, draped in a silk evening gown, live streaming the entire event to her followers. Donovan, however, looked like a man standing on a trap door. He was constantly checking his phone, pacing near the kitchen, his smile tight and forced. The realization that his accounts were entirely locked was clearly eating him alive from the inside out. He was surrounded by opulence he could no longer afford, desperately hoping Monday morning would bring a banking miracle. He was not going to get a miracle. He was going to get me. I checked my watch. Right on schedule, a fleet of 4 unmarked black SUVs turned onto the street, moving with a synchronized, predatory, silent speed. They glided past the valet stand, ignoring the confused attendants, and parked directly on the manicured front lawn. The doors opened simultaneously. I stepped out of the town car, the frigid wind whipping the hem of my tailored wool coat. I did not walk alone. Following closely behind me was the local county sheriff, accompanied by 6 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. We walked up the stone steps. I did not knock. I reached out and pushed the heavy double doors wide open. The transition from the freezing night into the warm, bustling foyer was instant. The string quartet was positioned right by the entrance. As the armed federal agents flooded into the hallway, the cellist faltered. The music ground to a screeching, discordant halt. The sudden silence rippled through the massive house like a shockwave. Over 100 guests stopped talking, turning their heads toward the front doors. Stephanie saw me first. Her eyes widened in absolute fury. She handed her recording phone to a bridesmaid and marched toward the foyer, her silk gown swishing angrily against the hardwood floor. "Caroline, what are you doing here?" Stephanie demanded, her voice echoing in the dead silent room. "You are not invited. Get out of my house right now before I call security." I did not say a word. I did not even look at her. I simply took one step to the right, clearing the path. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, his badge visibly clipped to his belt. His expression was entirely devoid of emotion. He looked past Stephanie, completely ignoring her temper tantrum, and locked his eyes on the 2 older figures standing frozen near the fireplace. Thomas and Brenda. My father dropped his bourbon glass. It shattered against the stone hearth, amber liquid pooling across the floor. My mother let out a sharp, gasping breath, clutching her chest. They recognized the jackets. They recognized the inevitable consequence of their actions, walking straight toward them. Thomas and Brenda, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying the booming, unquestionable authority of the federal government. "Step away from the crowd and keep your hands where I can see them." The wealthy guests scrambled backward, parting like the Red Sea, desperate to distance themselves from whatever disaster was unfolding. Whispers erupted across the room as the agents quickly moved in, forming a tactical circle around my parents. "Officer, what is the meaning of this?" Thomas tried to muster his usual arrogant bluster, but his voice cracked violently. "This is a private residence. We are hosting a party. You cannot just barge in here. You are under arrest by order of the United States Department of Justice," the agent stated, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent room. "You are being charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, aggravated identity theft, and title fraud." Brenda began to hyperventilate, her knees buckling slightly. She reached out for my father, but an agent firmly grabbed her wrist, twisting her arms behind her back. "This is a mistake. This is..." Brenda shrieked, her carefully curated country club persona shattering into a million pieces. "We did not steal anything. It is our house. We gave it to our daughter. Caroline, tell them it is a misunderstanding." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting in the pockets of my coat. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. I let the absolute zero temperature of my gaze freeze the remaining breath in her lungs. "You bribed a corrupt notary public in a strip mall to forge my signature on a federal quitclaim deed," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent, horrified room. "You transferred a co-owned asset into Stephanie's name and committed a federal felony. The notary confessed to the FBI an hour ago. He gave them the security footage of you handing him an envelope of cash." The gasps from the surrounding guests were audible. The country club wives, who had just been praising Brenda's generosity, were now staring at her in absolute utter disgust. Donovan pushed his way through the crowd, his face pale and sweating. "Wait a minute," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "We had nothing to do with this. Stephanie and I just got the deed as a gift. We did not know anything about a forged signature." The lead agent turned his attention to Donovan. "That is an interesting defense, sir. It might have held up if you had not taken that forged deed into a federally insured bank 2 days ago and used it as collateral to sign a fraudulent application for a $500,000 home equity line of credit." Donovan's jaw dropped. The realization hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. The frozen account, the declined credit cards, the bank telling him his funds were under administrative review. It was not a glitch. It was a federal sting operation. "You committed bank fraud." The agent continued, signaling for 2 more deputies to step forward. "That is a separate federal offense. Your accounts are seized. Your assets are frozen." Stephanie let out a blood-curdling scream. She fell to her knees, ruining her designer dress, sobbing hysterically as the agents locked the steel cuffs around her husband's wrists. Donovan did not fight back. He looked completely hollowed out, staring blankly at the floor as his entire fake tech empire vaporized into thin air. My mother was weeping uncontrollably, mascara running down her face, as she was marched toward the front door in handcuffs. Thomas hung his head in absolute shame, refusing to make eye contact with any of the wealthy friends he had spent his entire life trying to impress. They were paraded right past me. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated their humiliated faces. I did not flinch. I watched the agents load the people who had exploited me into the back of federal transport vehicles. The housewarming party was over. The estate belonged to me again, and their reign of toxic manipulation was permanently terminated. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the freezing Chicago night, leaving the grand estate eerily quiet. The wealthy guests had fled the scene the moment the federal agents pulled out their handcuffs, treating the housewarming party like a sinking ship. Only Stephanie remained. She was kneeling on the imported hardwood floor of the grand foyer, her designer silk gown stained with spilled champagne and her own running makeup. She looked up at me, her face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and absolute terror. "Caroline, you cannot do this!" she sobbed violently, clutching the banister of the sweeping staircase. "Where am I supposed to go? Donovan is gone. Mom and Dad are arrested. This is my house." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. "It is not your house, Stephanie. It never was." I pulled my phone from my tailored coat pocket and sent a single text message. Less than a minute later, a heavily armored transport van pulled into the circular driveway. 4 private security contractors dressed in tactical black gear stepped out and walked right through the open front doors. I had kept my private security team waiting on standby a block away for this exact moment. "Clear the property," I instructed the head of the security team, keeping my voice perfectly level. "She has 10 minutes to gather her immediate personal necessities. Everything else goes out the door." Stephanie screamed as the contractors moved right past her. They marched upstairs and began hauling heavy black trash bags filled with her expensive clothing, designer shoes, and imported cosmetic kits. They did not pack her luxury items with care. They dragged the bags down the polished wooden stairs and hurled them straight out the front doors onto the frozen snow-covered lawn. "You are a monster," Stephanie shrieked, as a security guard firmly grabbed her arm and escorted her toward the exit. "You are destroying your own family." I watched her stumble out into the bitter winter wind, shivering uncontrollably in her ruined evening gown. She fell to her knees in the snow, surrounded by the plastic bags containing the fake lifestyle she had tried to build on my dime. I stepped forward and pulled the heavy oak doors shut, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying metallic click. The house was finally silent. The toxic infection had been completely eradicated from my property. 6 months passed. The federal justice system moves with a slow, crushing inevitability, and it absolutely obliterated the people who tried to destroy me. The bank immediately voided the $500,000 loan application the moment the FBI confirmed the fraudulent collateral. But the financial institution did not stop there. Their aggressive corporate legal team filed a massive civil suit against Donovan, compounding his federal criminal charges. The fake tech startup executive was exposed as a complete fraud with zero actual revenue and a long history of unpaid debts. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, including the digital footprint of the bank application and the security footage of the corrupt notary, Donovan was denied bail. He is currently sitting in a maximum security federal detention center, awaiting trial for bank fraud and wire fraud. He is facing a mandatory minimum sentence that will ensure he spends the best years of his life locked in a concrete cell. My parents fared no better. Thomas and Brenda were indicted on multiple felony counts of conspiracy and real estate fraud. They tried to hire a high-powered defense attorney to fight the charges, but without my silent financial backing, their resources evaporated instantly. They were forced to liquidate their entire retirement portfolios and drain their pensions dry just to cover the exorbitant legal retainer fees. It did not save them. The federal evidence was too overwhelming to fight. They are both currently serving their sentences in a federal correctional institution, stripped of their country club status, their fake wealth, and their freedom. Stephanie filed for divorce the moment Donovan was indicted, desperately trying to distance herself from his massive criminal fallout. But the damage was already permanently woven into her life. Without Donovan's fake corporate income, and without my stolen equity, she was left holding the bag for the massive credit card debts they had accumulated to fund their illusion of wealth. The designer clothes, the lavish wedding upgrades, and the luxury car reservations crashed down on her all at once. She is currently working a minimum wage retail job, drowning in collections notices, and living in a tiny, cramped apartment far away from the affluent suburbs she once claimed to rule. As for the legal status of the Chicago estate, the federal court swiftly nullified the forged quitclaim deed. Full, absolute ownership of the property was restored to me within a matter of weeks. I did not keep the house. It held too many toxic memories of a family that only viewed me as a disposable financial resource. I listed the property on the open market during a massive regional inventory shortage. Because I had maintained the estate in pristine condition for years, it sparked a brutal bidding war. I sold the house for $950,000 in pure cash. I took the massive profit and immediately reinvested it into a highly diversified municipal bond portfolio, securing my financial independence for the rest of my life. I stepped out onto the expansive wooden balcony of my Lake Tahoe vacation home. The harsh winter snows had melted away, giving way to a bright, crisp mountain spring. The sun glinted off the crystal blue water of the lake, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The air was incredibly fresh and clean. I held a chilled crystal flute of vintage champagne in my hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the crisp, dry taste of absolute, total victory. I had not spoken to a single member of my biological family since the night I locked the heavy oak doors of the Chicago estate. I had blocked their numbers, ignored their desperate letters from prison, and completely erased them from my existence. I leaned against the cedar railing, feeling the warm sunlight on my face. I had protected my assets, defended my boundaries, and legally dismantled the parasites who tried to bleed me dry. I was completely free. I was wealthy beyond measure. And most importantly, I was finally at peace. I raised my champagne glass to the sprawling, majestic mountains standing tall and unbreakable against the clear blue sky. Family is not blood. Family is the people who never forged your signature. The chilling yet empowering story of Caroline serves as a masterclass in establishing unbreakable boundaries and protecting one's hard-earned peace. The profound lesson to be drawn from her journey is that sharing DNA with someone does not grant them a free pass to exploit, manipulate, or steal from you. For too long, society has conditioned us to believe that family is an absolute bond and that we must endure endless toxicity out of sheer obligation. However, Caroline's narrative shatters that dangerous myth, proving that blind loyalty can easily be weaponized by those who view you not as a loved one, but as a convenient financial safety net. Her ultimate triumph was not just about outsmarting a corrupt system or triggering a federal fraud investigation. It was about reclaiming her self-worth. She taught us the absolute necessity of financial literacy and independence. When you understand how to protect your own assets, you strip toxic people of their leverage over you. More importantly, she demonstrated that true strength does not lie in screaming, throwing tantrums, or begging for an apology from people incapable of remorse. True power lies in cold, calculated detachment. It is the realization that you do not owe your peace of mind to people who actively plot your destruction behind your back. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is stepping aside and letting the people who hurt you face the devastating, inescapable consequences of their own unforced errors. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep your relatives warm. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and genuine support, not on forged signatures and parasitic greed. Walking away from a toxic bloodline is not a tragedy, it is your ultimate victory. If this story empowered you to finally set firm boundaries and protect your own peace, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own triumphs over toxic relationships in the comments below.